Imagine for a moment that you're 10 years old. It's close to Christmas time, and you're doing what a 10-year-old does around Christmas time, and you're snooping around your parents' house. You want to find some of those hidden Christmas presents. But instead of finding the Christmas presents, you end up finding a few boxes. The boxes contain some newspaper clippings, some cards, and some letters. The strange thing is that the newspaper clippings have weird headlines. Headlines that read, "Mother asks kidnapper to return baby," or another article that says, "200 search for missing baby." The photo of the baby's parents ends up being a picture of your parents. This is the story of Paul Joseph Fronczak. And this is just the beginning. Hi, I'm your host, Missy, and I'm about to take you on a wild ride. Stories with plot twists, shocking endings, and unbelievable truths. Trust me when I tell you that this story is nuts. To get to the whole story, we need to start at the beginning. We'll start with Dora. Dora Fronczak had just given birth to her son Paul in April of 1964 at the Michael Reese Hospital in Chicago. Paul was less than 2 days old when a middle-aged nurse told Dora that they needed to run some tests on the new baby and took him away. And of course, at first, nothing here seems amiss. Unknown to Dora, however, the woman who took Paul was not a nurse at all, and Dora would not even discover this until 7 o'clock that night. The woman had already visited Dora once that morning around 9:30 a.m. as Dora was breastfeeding. When she came into Dora's room, she checked on both mom and baby, and then she left. So then when the woman returned the room around 1:53 p.m., Dora didn't have any reason to question her. At 2:30 p.m., when a different nurse came into Dora's hospital room to take Paul to the nursery, Dora told her that Paul was already there. Now, this other nurse was confused. She leaves the room to try to track down young Paul. And after a little bit of time, the hospital staff realizes that there is something wrong here because they cannot find the baby. Instead of telling Dora, though, they decide to keep this quiet. They don't want Dora to be concerned. They don't want her to freak out, basically. And so they want to keep her calm. And that's what they do. When hospital staff does their own investigation, they find that the unidentified woman who was dressed as a nurse was seen leaving the hospital through a back door by another nurse shortly after the baby was said to have been taken out of Dora's room. A cab driver also remembers giving her a ride and dropping her off mere blocks from the hospital with the baby. This woman, so the nurse, had also visited the hospital the day before Paul was taken. She was dressed as a nurse again, walking around the hospital hallways and folding towels. And in fact, Dora wasn't the only mother visited in the Michael Reese Hospital. Named Lisa Cohen, who had also given birth around the same time as Dora, recounted that she too had a visit from the mysterious woman twice. The first time was to look at the baby, and then the second time was to ask for the baby. Lisa, unlike Dora, felt skeptical of the mysterious woman, and after questioning her, the woman promptly left. Although her description varies depending on the news articles of the time, states that she's 35 to 40 years old, she has a reddish complexion, salt and pepper colored hair, she's anywhere from 5'4" to 5'7" in height, and she's probably of European descent. Chester Fronczak, Paul's father, and Dora's husband, is working when he hears the news that his child is missing. He rushes to his wife Dora's side, and he has to be the one to tell her that their son is missing. Once the media hears the case, they descend on Chester and Dora, who plead with the kidnapper to safely return the baby. Chester begs if they will not return the child to at least take care of him and newspapers print formula recipes just in case whoever has him will at least know how to take care of him. The Fronczaks are bombarded with reporters who hung around their home nonstop as the media storm continued. The search for Paul Joseph Fronczak was one of the biggest search operations ever performed in Chicago, a search that included hundreds of police officers, the FBI, and even 200,000 mail carriers who were told to be on high alert for anything suspicious. But even with all of the eyes on this case, Paul Fronczak was gone. That is until 14 months later. In July of 1965, an anonymous phone call to police was made about a young boy who was found left in a stroller outside of a very busy variety store in Newark, New Jersey. The boy was placed into foster care, named Scott, and even baptized under this name. His foster family, the Eckerts, were planning on adopting him after he lived with them for a year. However, one day in 1966, the FBI knocked on their door claiming they believed Scott was actually Paul. In 1964, when Paul was born, only a single photo of him was taken. No fingerprints, no footprints, and no blood was drawn. DNA really wasn't even a thing yet either. So the only thing that the FBI had to go on was this single photo. In the photo, Paul is shown at a side angle, and he has a prominent ear in this photo. And since no two ears are alike, they're like fingerprints, the FBI compared the photo to Scott. And off of this one photo, the FBI determined that out of 10,000 other children, that Scott was actually Paul. With this information, Dora and Chester make the long drive to New Jersey to make a positive ID of the child. And although Dora could have no way of actually knowing if this was in fact Paul, she believed the FBI when they told her it was. The Fronczaks adopted him and once again named him Paul Joseph Fronczak. So it's 10 years later. Paul is looking around and he finds these boxes containing the newspaper clippings. When he asks his mother about them, she at first scolds him, but then she admitted that Paul had been kidnapped as a child and stated, "We found you, we love you, and that's all that you need to know." And for a while it was. Paul actually had a really happy life with his parents and his younger brother Dave. But as he got older, he started to feel like he didn't fit in. In fact, Paul noticed he didn't look like his brother or his father, and he really didn't have the same interests either. Paul was different. These differences made Paul remember that box that he found when he was 10. And although his parents refused to talk about it, Paul often wondered who he was. And this was something that would sit with him for quite a long time. When Paul was 18, he moved to Arizona and joined a rock band. And then one day when he was at CVS, Paul spotted a DNA kit that he could afford, and so he bought it. He stored the kit in his closet, where it sat untouched for months. It wasn't long after he bought the kit that his parents Chester and Dora came for a visit. An hour before Paul was going to give them a ride to the airport to go back to Chicago, Paul finally asked them if they ever wondered if he was their real son, and if they would be willing to take this test. The three swabbed their cheeks and collected their DNA. But as soon as their flight returned home, Chester and Dora called Paul and asked him not to send the test in. They didn't want to know. Of course, Paul was heartbroken. He needed to know the answers, but he didn't want to go behind the backs of the people who raised him. So the test sat for 3 weeks until Paul, who could no longer wait, sent them in. 2 weeks later, Paul received a phone call that would forever change his life. There was no chance that he was related to Dora or Chester Fronczak. So Paul Joseph Fronczak found out he wasn't Paul Joseph Fronczak at all. In fact, Paul had no idea who he really was, including his real name or his birthday. In that moment, Paul not only lost who he thought he was, but he also lost his parents, Chester and Dora, who, angry at him for submitting the tests, refused to speak to him for 2 years. However painful to Paul that was, he knew he not only had to find out his true identity, but now he wanted to find out where was the real Paul Joseph Fronczak. He made it his mission then to find the baby who had been stolen on that fateful day back in 1964. Paul knew he had work to do, so he contacted George Knapp, an American television investigative reporter who's known for his work as the host of Coast to Coast AM. He told George the story, and immediately George offered to help Paul solve his case. After airing a 5-minute segment, Paul's story went national. He was soon getting phone calls from various news outlets, all wanting to hear what he had to say. But at this point in time, genetic technology had still a long ways to go, and his story would remain unsolved for several more years. Genetic genealogist C.C. Moore and her team at DNA Detectives, along with the major DNA databanks including Ancestry.com, 23andMe, and a company called Family Tree DNA, offered to help Paul. With this help, Paul was only able to find the name of a second cousin who unfortunately dies in the hospital right before the two are supposed to meet. And it wouldn't be until 2015 when C.C. Moore and her team are finally able to give Paul some closure into his past. Through C.C. Moore, Paul learns that his real name is Jack Rosenthal, and he has a twin sister named Jill. Jill's whereabouts are unknown, and she could not be tracked down, although according to C.C. and Paul, she is likely dead. Paul also learns that he has 3 other siblings, none of whom remember the twins. And according to other family members, his biological parents were abusive drunks who would lock the twins in cages. One day, the twins were just gone, and his parents had told one side of the family that the twins were to be watched by the other side, and vice versa. And after a while, the parents finally just stated that the twins had been adopted by them. And when that hadn't worked out for them, they returned them. The story about the adoption is untrue, however, based on Jack and Jill's birth certificates. And any photos of the twins were removed from family photo albums, and family members were also told to never speak of the twins again. Jack, who still goes by the name of Paul, has figured out where he came from. He figured out his past. But now he's really still hoping to find out what happened to the real Paul Fronczak. He wants to do it for his parents, Dora and Chester, even though they're really not interested in finding out the truth of what happened to their missing baby. Paul makes it a mission. Using photos of Chester and Dora, and David, Paul's brother, an age progression photo is made of what Paul would look like as an adult. But as they receive some tips from men who believe they could be Paul, Chester, Dora, and David refuse to submit DNA. Another unknown, unnamed family member of the Fronczaks, however, did submit DNA, which helped speed the process of finding Paul along. Because in December of 2018, news reports began to surface, saying that the real Paul Joseph Fronczak was finally found. Although the FBI hadn't closed the case at the time of these reports, they have stated that they shared with the real Paul, who lives in Michigan, his identity, and are allowing him to process the news. He has not come out to the public, and according to sources, he has not met with his birth mother, Dora. His birth father, Chester, passed away in 2017. Paul Fronczak, or Jack Rosenthal, whatever you want to call him, he's written a book about his journey into finding himself titled The Foundling, the true story of a kidnapping, a family secret, and the search for the real me, which he published before the real Paul was discovered. He also has a blog that you can read about his story and see what he's doing now at foundlingpaul.com/blog. Paul believes that his sister Jill was met with foul play, and he's still searching for answers into her whereabouts, going as far to search the property that his birth parents once lived in order to find her remains. The nurse who kidnapped Paul on that day in 1964 was never found. My sources for today's podcast were foundlingpaul.com/blog. Check it out, see what he's doing now. BBC.com. NBCChicago.com, and freep.com. Also the 2020 episode, Stolen at Birth, and the Thin Air podcast. As always, if you've liked today's episode, please give it a like. Please subscribe And come back next time for another episode of This Story is Nuts. This next story next week is going to be really, really good as well. Not that this one wasn't good, but it's going to be really, really good. I really look forward to giving you a lot of crazy stories. If you have a story, please let me know. If you have something that you're interested in talking about, that you want to hear more about, or hey, maybe something like this has happened to you. And I'm sorry if it has. What a crazy thing to have happened. But if it did, definitely drop me a comment. And as always, come back next week for an all-new episode of This Story is Nuts. This Story is Nuts was written and produced by Missy Reese. Theme music composed by Logan Reese off of GroovePad.